I still remember the last time my grandmother recognized my face. It was a Tuesday in April, the kind of soft spring morning where the light comes through the windows like honey, and you can almost believe that time is kind instead of cruel. I had just finished brushing her hair silver white, fine as spider silk, the same hair I remembered braiding when I was 6, and she was 60, and the world still made sense. She looked up at me, her eyes cloudy with the fog that had been eating her mind for 3 years, and she smiled. Not the confused, frightened smile she gave to strangers. The real one, the one that knew me. "Margaret," she whispered, "you've grown." She died 3 months later, not in the mansion where she had raised 3 children and buried one husband and planted a garden that had outlived most of her memories, but in a small room in a city she had never visited, surrounded by people who had learned her name from a video on the internet. I was holding her hand. Her other children were not there. And as her breathing slowed to nothing, I felt something that wasn't grief and wasn't victory. It was the feeling of finally, after 36 years, being enough. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're new here, my name is Margaret, and what I'm about to tell you is a story about the inheritance of lies. The kind that doesn't come with a lawyer or a will reading, but with a smile and a document and a child who learns too late that their family sees them as a line item instead of a person. If you've ever held someone's hand while the world tried to sell their memory for parts, stay with me. Hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications, and listen until the end. Because this story doesn't end with a mansion. It ends with a room full of strangers who became family. Here's my story. I was 31 when I became a ghost, not the kind that haunts houses. The kind that haunts kitchens at 3 a.m., measuring medication into tiny cups, checking for bedsores, singing lullabies to a woman who sometimes thought I was her mother and sometimes thought I was a nurse, and sometimes looked at me with eyes so empty I could see straight through to my own reflection. My grandmother Vivian had raised me. Not officially, my parents were alive. Technically, though my father's death 5 years earlier had been more of a relief than a tragedy, and my mother had moved to Arizona with a yoga instructor when I was 12. But Vivian was the one who taught me to read, to cook, to plant tomatoes in soil that she swore remembered every hand that had touched it. She was the one who sat with me when I failed my driver's test, who drove me to my nursing school interviews, who told me that caring for people was not a weakness but architecture, the kind that holds the world up when everything else falls apart. She was also the one who, at 86, started leaving the stove on, who called me by my mother's name, then by her sister's name, then by no name at all, who looked at the garden she had tended for 60 years and asked in a voice like a child's, "Whose flowers are these?" The diagnosis came on a Thursday. Alzheimer's, early stage, progressing. The doctor spoke to my Aunt Helen and my Uncle Robert because they were the ones who had taken Vivian to the appointment. I found out from a text message. A text message from Helen, 3 words long. "She's losing it, meeting Sunday." The Sunday meeting was held in Vivian's drawing room, the one with the windows that faced the garden and the furniture that smelled like lemon oil and old money. Helen sat in Vivian's chair, not deliberately, I don't think, but with the unconscious entitlement of someone who had always assumed that every chair would eventually be hers. Robert paced, checking his phone, his thumb scrolling through crypto prices with the obsessive rhythm of a man who had lost more money than most people would ever see. "She can't live alone," Helen said. She was a corporate lawyer, the kind who spoke in paragraphs and made you feel like you were already losing an argument you hadn't agreed to have. "I've looked into facilities. The good ones start at $12,000 a month. The estate can cover it, but we need to start liquidating assets. The house, primarily." "The house," I said. I was standing by the window, my hand on the glass, looking out at the garden where Vivian had taught me to distinguish between basil and oregano by smell alone. "She can't leave the house. This is her home, this is where Margaret." Helen's voice was patient, the tone she used for opposing counsel who were about to be destroyed. "I understand you're attached, but sentiment doesn't pay for round-the-clock care. Robert and I have discussed it. We're going to list the property. There's a developer interested in converting it to luxury condos. The sale would fund her care for years, with plenty left over for what?" I interrupted. I had never interrupted Helen before. She was the kind of woman who made you wait for permission to breathe. "For your campaign, for Robert's next investment scheme." Robert looked up from his phone. He had the family eyes, blue and sharp, but his had the flat shine of someone who had learned to see everything as a transaction. "That's unfair, Margaret. We're thinking of Vivian's best interests." "No," I said. You're thinking of your best interests. The house is paid off. The taxes are manageable. She doesn't need to be in a facility. She needs to be here, with people who know her, who know that she likes her tea at exactly 4 p.m., not 3:45 or 4:15, who know that she hums Moon River when she's anxious, who know that the garden isn't just pretty flowers, it's the last thing she still recognizes. Helen stood up. She was wearing a suit the color of dried blood, and she moved with the precision of a blade. You're a nurse, Margaret, not a gerontologist, not a financial planner, and certainly not Vivian's legal guardian. Robert and I have power of attorney, the decision is made. I looked at Robert, he looked at his shoes. He had always looked at his shoes when Helen made decisions, it was the closest he came to having a spine. And what about me? I asked. My voice was quiet. I had learned to be quiet in this family. Loudness was Helen's territory, and she defended it fiercely. You can visit. Helen said, the facility I've chosen is excellent, very highly rated, they have art therapy. She hates art therapy, she hates strangers touching her, she hates, Margaret. Helen's voice was final, a period at the end of a sentence I wasn't allowed to write. This isn't a discussion, it's a notification. The house goes on the market in 30 days. Vivian moves next week. I suggest you start packing her things. They left me standing in the drawing room, the afternoon light turning the dust motes into golden constellations, the garden outside waiting for a hand that would never touch it again. I didn't cry. I had learned not to cry in front of this family. Tears were currency, and they never paid fair value. I went upstairs to Vivian's room. She was sleeping, her face peaceful in a way it never was when she was awake and confused. I sat by her bed and took her hand. It was papery, spotted with age, the fingers slightly curled from arthritis. I remembered those hands teaching me to tie my shoes, to roll pie crust, to hold a needle steady enough to sew a button. I remembered them holding mine at my father's funeral, squeezing once, twice, a code that meant I'm here and you're not alone and we will survive this. Vivian, I whispered. What do you want? She didn't answer. She was deep in whatever dreams the dying brain allows, perhaps a place where she was young and the garden was new and the future was still a promise instead of a threat. But as I watched her, I noticed something. Her nightgown had shifted, and there was a shape against her chest. A small rectangle, hard and unfamiliar. I reached under the fabric, gentle as I could be, and pulled out a USB drive. Old, plastic, the kind you buy in packs of 10 at office supply stores. There was a label on it, in Vivian's handwriting, shaky now, but still recognizable, that said, "For Margaret, when they try to take everything." I sat there for a long time, the drive cold in my palm, my heart beating in my throat like a bird trying to escape. Then I went to my room, found my laptop, and plugged it in. The video was dated 2 years earlier. Before the diagnosis, before the confusion, before Helen and Robert had started treating Vivian like a portfolio to be liquidated. She was sitting in the same chair in the same room, but her eyes were clear and her voice was strong, and she was looking directly into the camera with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not grandmotherly. Not gentle. Fierce. Margaret, she said, if you're watching this, it means they've started. Helen with her spreadsheets, Robert with his desperation. They think I'm losing my mind, and they're not wrong. The doctors say the fog is coming. But I'm not lost yet, and I need you to know what I want before they convince you that what they want is the same thing. She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk in front of her. This house is not an asset. It is a promise. My mother raised me here, I raised your father here, and I wanted to raise your children here, but life had other plans. What I want now is simpler. I want this house to become a place for people like me. People whose minds are leaving before their bodies. A small clinic. A refuge. A place where the garden still grows and the tea is served at 4 p.m. and no one is rushed into forgetting because it's more convenient for the people who inherit. She smiled, and it was the smile I remembered from my childhood, the one that made me feel like I was the only person in the world worth looking at. I've set up the legal framework. The house is in a trust that Helen and Robert cannot break without your consent, but they will try. They will try to sell it, to move me, to make you feel small and stupid and in the way. Don't let them. You are the only one who sees me, the only one who ever has. Her expression shifted, became something harder. And if they force your hand, if they make it impossible to save the house, then I want you to do something for me. Not for revenge, for truth. Record everything. Show the world who they are when they think no one is watching. Not because I want them punished, because I want you to survive. Because I want you to know that you were always my choice, Margaret. My real choice. Not the default, not the afterthought, the daughter of my heart. The video ended. I sat in the dark, the laptop screen glowing blue on my face, and I cried. Not for Vivian, not for the house, not even for myself. I cried for the version of my family that had never existed, the one where Helen was kind and Robert was brave, and my father had lived long enough to tell me that he saw me too. Then I dried my face. I put the USB drive in my pocket, and I started planning. Helen and Robert moved Vivian to a facility called Golden Meadows the following week. It was not golden. It was not a meadow. It was a concrete building with fluorescent lights, and the smell of industrial disinfectant that reminded me of hospitals where hope goes to die. The staff were not cruel, but they were stretched thin, and Vivian spent her first night calling my name into a darkness that didn't answer. I quit my job at the hospital the next day. I told my supervisor I was taking a leave of absence to care for a family member. She understood. She had seen me check my phone during shifts, seen the way my face changed when Vivian's name appeared on the screen. She wished me luck. She didn't know that luck was not a resource I had access to. I moved into Golden Meadows. Not officially, I couldn't afford a room there, and Helen had made it clear that my emotional involvement was counterproductive to Vivian's adjustment. But I found an apartment 3 blocks away, a studio with a hot plate and a shower that ran cold, and I spent every hour that the facility allowed in Vivian's room. I brought her tea at 4 p.m. I brushed her hair. I sang Moon River when she became agitated. I learned the names of the other residents, their stories, the families who visited every day and the families who never came, and I watched Helen and Robert. Helen visited once a month, always on a Sunday, always for exactly 20 minutes. She brought flowers from a grocery store, the kind that died in 2 days. She took selfies with Vivian, positioning herself so that Vivian's confused face was visible but not too visible, the caption always some variation of "visiting my brave mother." So hard to watch them fade. Grateful for excellent care. The likes poured in. The comments called her inspiring and devoted. She never replied to any of them. Robert visited even less. Every 6 weeks, sometimes 8. He brought documents. Always documents. Power of attorney amendments, trust revisions. Clarifications to Vivian's will. He would sit by her bed, speaking in the loud, slow voice people use for the hard of hearing, even though Vivian's hearing was fine and her comprehension was the problem. Just sign here, Mom. It's for your own good, just a little X. You remember how to make an X? She didn't. She would look at the pen with the bewildered expression of a child asked to perform calculus. Sometimes she would cry. Sometimes she would call him by my father's name, which made Robert's face tighten with something that looked like anger but was probably fear. Fear that she would say something in a moment of clarity that would expose what he was doing. I recorded all of it, not with a hidden camera that would have been illegal and Helen would have used it to destroy me, but with my phone, openly, casually. I'm making a memory book for her, I would tell the staff, showing them videos of Vivian on good days, her face lighting up at a bird outside the window, her hands moving automatically to knead imaginary dough. They thought I was sweet. They didn't know that I was also recording the bad days. The days Helen came and left without touching Vivian's hand. The days Robert brought papers and frustration. The days Vivian asked, in a voice like broken glass, "Where is my house? Where are my flowers? Who are these people?" I recorded the phone calls too. The ones Helen made from Vivian's room, discussing the timeline for liquidation with her real estate agent. The ones Robert made from the hallway, telling his business partner that the old bat signature is the last piece we need for the condo conversion. I recorded them because Vivian had asked me to, and because I had spent 31 years being quiet in this family and I was done. But recording was not enough. I knew that. Helen was running for a judgeship, a position on the state circuit court that would make her untouchable. Her campaign was built on a foundation of family values, of caring for our most vulnerable, of the same performative devotion she showed in her monthly selfies. If I released the videos now, she would spin it. She would say I was a disgruntled relative. She would say I was exploiting my grandmother's illness for attention. She would say the videos were edited, taken out of context. The desperate act of a woman who had never achieved anything on her own. She would not be entirely wrong about that last part. I had never achieved anything on my own. I had been a good nurse, a good granddaughter, a good daughter to parents who didn't deserve it, but I had never been brave. I had never been visible. I had never been the protagonist of my own story. I spent 3 months learning to change that. I learned to edit video, Not well, but well enough. I learned to build a narrative from hours of footage, to find the moments that spoke louder than any accusation. I learned to create a YouTube channel with no name attached, to use a voice modulator for the narration, to upload from public Wi-Fi so the IP address couldn't be traced back to me. And I learned to care for Vivian in the ways that mattered. I brought her back to the house. Not permanently. Helen and Robert had already listed it, and the developers were circling like vultures who wore suits and called themselves urban revitalization specialists. But I brought her for afternoons, smuggling her out in a friend's car, driving her through the garden she had built with her own hands. She didn't always know where she was. But sometimes, she would touch a rosebush and smile. Sometimes she would sit on the bench by the tomato plants and close her eyes. Sometimes she would look at me and say, "Margaret, you've grown." Those were the moments I built the documentary around. Not the accusations, not the documents, just the contrast. Vivian in the garden, her face peaceful, her hands in the dirt. Helen in the facility, her face composed, her hands on her phone. Robert with his papers. The staff at Golden Meadows, kind but overwhelmed, versus the space that Vivian had made that still held her memory in every leaf and petal. I called it the inheritance. Not the inheritance of lies, though that was what it was. Just the inheritance. A quiet title. A title that made you think of wills and family portraits and the things we pass down without meaning to. The things we steal without knowing we're thieves. I uploaded it on a Tuesday. The same day as Helen's confirmation hearing. The video was 23 minutes long. It started with Vivian in the garden, young and strong, teaching a child, me, to plant seeds. It transitioned to Vivian in the facility, old and confused, asking where her flowers were. It showed Helen's visits, measured in minutes and selfies. It showed Robert's visits, measured in documents and frustration. It showed me face blurred, voice altered, holding Vivian's hand through the night, singing Moon River, bringing tea at 4:00 p.m. The narration was not angry. It was sad. It was the voice of someone who had loved a family and watched it curdle into something unrecognizable. "This is my grandmother," it said. "This is her garden, this is her house. This is what remains when the people who should care only see value." It ended with Vivian's video, the one from the USB drive, her fierce face, her clear voice, her final words. "You were always my choice, Margaret, my real choice." I didn't watch the numbers. I didn't read the comments. I sat in my studio apartment, 3 blocks from Golden Meadows, and I waited for the world to do what the world does. It took 48 hours for Helen's nomination to be withdrawn. The video had been shared by a local journalist, then picked up by a national news outlet, then dissected by legal blogs that questioned whether someone who treated her own mother as a liquidation asset should be judging anyone's fate. Helen issued a statement calling the video a malicious fabrication by a mentally unstable family member. She threatened lawsuits. She hired a PR firm. But the internet does not forget, and the video showed her face, her voice, her own words about excellent care, contrasted with the reality of a mother who didn't recognize her. Robert's investors pulled out within a week. His crypto fund, already shaky, collapsed completely when the video was linked to his name in financial forums. He called me drunk at 2:00 a.m., screaming that I had destroyed him. I hung up. I had learned from Vivian that some conversations are not worth having, but the house was already sold. The developers had paid in cash, the closing had been rushed through, and by the time the video went viral, Vivian's signature, or rather, the X that Robert had coaxed from her confused hand, was legally binding. I could have fought it. I could have spent years in court, draining the small savings I had, watching Helen and Robert use their resources to bury me in motions and delays. I chose not to, because Vivian had given me something more important than the house. She had given me permission to let go. I used the money that poured in from strangers who had watched the video and wanted to help. Not much, a few $1,000s, sent to a P.O. box I had set up, accompanied by letters from people who had their own Helens, their own Roberts, their own Vivians who had been forgotten in facilities that smelled of bleach and broken promises. I used it to move Vivian out of Golden Meadows. I used it to rent a small house in a city 3 hours away, a house with a garden that needed work and neighbors who brought casseroles and asked about Vivian by name. I used it to start something small. A clinic not for Alzheimer's specifically, but for anyone whose family had decided they were too much trouble. A place where the tea was served at 4:00 p.m., where the garden grew tomatoes and roses and whatever else the residents remembered from their own lives, where no one was rushed into forgetting because it was convenient. We had 6 residents at first, then 12, then 20. I hired nurses who understood that care was not just medication and hygiene but presence. The kind of presence Vivian had taught me. The kind that says, I see you, even when you don't see yourself, even when you don't see me. Vivian lived for 4 more months. She never recognized the new house, but she recognized the garden. She would sit in the sun, her hands in the dirt, and hum songs I didn't know. Sometimes she would look at me and call me by my mother's name. Sometimes she would call me by her sister's name. And once, only once, she looked at me with clear eyes and said, Margaret, you've grown. I smiled. I took her hand. I said, you taught me how. She died on a Tuesday in July, the same kind of soft morning as the last time she knew me. I was holding her hand. The garden was blooming. And for the first time in 36 years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not in the mansion, not in the family that had never deserved me, but in a room full of strangers who had become family, holding the hand of the woman who had chosen me when no one else had. I'm Margaret. I'm 36 years old. And this isn't the end of my story. It's the first chapter where I got to choose what I inherited. See you in the next story.